Welcome to Mysterious Sleep Stories. There is nothing you need to do right now. Whatever the day demanded of you, it has already received its answer. The hours that filled, dragged, and consumed you with a weight of petty obligations, the obligations you fulfilled and barely managed, are over, and what remains is this, a moment unconditionally, entirely yours. You don't need to cling to anything in your mind. You don't need to keep a record of anything. There is nothing that cannot wait until morning in this moment, and morning is far away, the distance between here and there soft, dark, and unhurried. Now let me tell you about a room. Not a dramatic room, not a room of special significance to the wider world, but a room that has everything a room needs to be, a place where a person can spend an evening in peace. A room filled with a lamp, a table, familiar tools, and the soft, constant sound of rain hitting the old window pane. A room where nothing needs to be resolved, where everything moves at its own quiet pace, and time slips by unnoticed. If you haven't already, lean back. The room is ready. He was waiting for you. It is an evening in London in the year 1873, and the rain has been falling since sometime in the middle of the afternoon. Since perhaps 3 o'clock, when the sky over Southwark had shifted from its ordinary overcast grey to a particular shade of uniform darkness that people who have lived in London for many years learn to recognise as the reliable predecessor of an evening's rain. Not violent rain. Not the kind that arrives with wind and makes itself felt as a physical force. Simply steady autumn rain of the sort that commits itself without drama, that settles into its work with the quiet efficiency of something that intends to continue for a long while and sees no reason to make more of itself than is necessary. The street outside is called Deadman's Lane. It is a name older than any of the buildings that line it, older than the gas pipes that were laid beneath its cobblestones in the 1840s, older than the present century itself, and it appears in parish records going back 300 years as a lane that has always been exactly what it is, narrow, practical, inhabited by the kind of commerce that functions without requiring any particular attention from those who do not already have reason to seek it out. It runs roughly north to south, connecting a broader street at each end, and it is paved with the same granite sets that pave most of the borough's older lanes, slightly uneven, fitted close, with the joints between them worn smooth by generations of iron-shod wheels and the particular patient erosion of rainwater finding its way downhill. On this evening, the rain collects in those joints and runs along them in thin, slow lines, gathering at the lower end of the street into a modest stream that disappears into the gutter at the corner. The gas lamp at the near end of the lane, one of 3 that serve this particular stretch, placed at intervals that leave a certain quantity of darkness between them, as was standard, burns with its characteristic amber quality, its light falling in a soft cone onto the wet cobblestones below and reflecting upward from the wet surfaces in a way that makes the circle of illuminated stone appear to glow faintly from within. Beyond this lamp, the darkness is not absolute, but it is thorough, broken only by the suggestion of the next lamp further along, visible as a slight warmth in the distance, offering orientation without illumination. The building is 3 stories of London brick, the kind of brick that starts red and becomes, over decades of coal smoke and city air, something closer to a dark brownish grey, not dirty exactly, but absorbing, dense, weathered to a color that seems to belong to the city rather than to any particular building or any particular era. The mortar between the courses has softened in the way that old mortar softens. Not crumbling, but rounded at the edges, having lost the crisp lines of new work and acquired instead the gentler profile of something that has been rained on many hundreds of times and has made its peace with rain. At the ground floor, A door and 2 windows face the lane. The door is fitted with a small bell of the kind that announces visitors by means of a simple spring mechanism connected to the latch, so that the bell rings when the door is opened and rings again, briefly, when it is pulled closed. The windows, set a few inches back from the building's face, are covered on the inside by heavy linen curtains whose original color, a deep, marine blue, has faded through long proximity to lamp black and coal dust to something closer to the grey of an overcast sky. Through these curtains, the faint amber presence of the gaslight from the street is just barely visible as a softened vertical shape, as though the light were a thing that could be folded and pressed between cloth layers and would remain there, still glowing, slightly diminished. The bell does not ring this evening. The door is locked. There are no visitors expected. The hour is advancing toward 9 o'clock and the workshop is occupied by only one person, which is, on most evenings, precisely as it ought to be. Mr. Aldous Fenwick makes ink. He has made ink in this workshop, in this building, on this lane, for 27 years. Before that, he made ink in a larger workshop on Bermondsey Street, where he worked as the sole assistant to a man named Gideon Marsh, who had been making iron gall ink since before Mr. Fenwick was born and who spoke of the trade in the same tone that clergymen used to speak of their vocations, not with ceremony, exactly, but with a quiet conviction that the thing being done is the right thing for the person doing it. Gideon Marsh died in the winter of 1846, in his 68th year, and left his tools and his recipes and his small stock of materials to his assistant, along with a note in his handwriting that said, in its entirety, "The galls want watching after rain. The gum wants watching always. The rest will look after itself." Mr. Fenwick has thought of this note many times in the years since, and has found it, on reflection, to be a more complete summary of the profession's requirements than many longer documents he has encountered. He is 61 years old, a fact of which he is intermittently aware in the way that one is intermittently aware of a familiar landscape. It is always there, but it does not always demand to be noticed. He is of moderate height, built with the slight solidity of a man who has spent his working life doing tasks that require steadiness rather than exertion, and he has the hands that his trade requires, large-knuckled, well-controlled, permanently stained at the fingertips and along the outer edges of both palms with the deep blue-black that is the lasting signature of a life spent near iron gall ink. These stains are not the result of carelessness. They are the result of proximity, of decades in which the hands have been the primary instruments through which the work is conducted, reaching into jars and lifting vessels and corking bottles and handling the materials in their various states, each stage of the process leaving its faint additional mark until the accumulation is simply the color of the skin at those particular points, as much a part of the man as any other feature. He wears tonight, as he wears every evening at work, a dark cotton apron over a plain flannel shirt. The apron is tied at the back with a length of tape that he loops and ties by habit without looking at it, the gesture as automatic as the way a person buttons a familiar coat without watching their fingers. His sleeves are rolled to just below the elbow and folded twice, with a neatness that is not achieved by particular effort but is simply the result of doing the same thing so many times that the hands know the correct tension and the correct fold without being directed to it. He wears wire-framed spectacles whose right lens has a small crack running from the lower corner upward at a gentle angle, a crack that has been there since March and that he has been intending to address and has not yet done. The lens does not meaningfully distort his vision. The crack is visible in certain light and invisible in others, and in the lamplight of the workshop it is invisible, so this evening it might as well not exist. The room itself is not large. It is perhaps 12 feet in either direction, with a ceiling low enough that a tall man might feel it as a presence, though Mr. Fenwick, who is not especially tall, has never thought about the ceiling at all. The walls are plastered and were once whitewashed, the whitewash now aged to the particular cream yellow that all interior plaster acquires through the slow accumulation of years of lamplight and the breath of small fires in winter and the imperceptible deposit of the things that float in the air of any working room, particles of gall dust and dried gum and the various microscopic traces of the ingredients that have been handled here across more than a quarter of a century. The floor is stone, dark, fitted with the slight imprecision of old stonework, with one slab near the door that has settled fractionally lower than the ones around it and produces, when walked upon at that particular angle, a sound that is not quite a click but not quite silence either, something between the two, a sound that Mr. Fenwick no longer hears because familiarity has made it as invisible as the cracked lens in his spectacles. Along the left wall, the long table sits beneath the oil lamp. The lamp is fixed to the wall on an iron bracket, positioned so that its light falls directly down onto the table's surface and slightly forward, illuminating the work area with a circle of warmth that is wide enough to contain everything on the table and narrow enough not to reach the far wall of the room. The lamp burns whale oil. Paraffin oil is available now and becoming common, but Mr. Fenwick has never changed, partly because of the particular quality of whale oil's light, which he finds steady and warm, and partly because the act of not changing is itself a form of attention to what has worked, or acknowledgement that what the trade has always required it still requires, and that novelty for its own sake is not among its requirements. The oil lamp's light on this particular evening is steady. The wick trimmed this morning to exactly the right height, the reservoir filled sufficiently to last the full evening and somewhat beyond. The flame is a small thing, perhaps 2 centimeters in height, enclosed in its glass chimney, burning without flickering because there is no draught in the room and the air is perfectly still. The shadows it casts are soft, not sharp, the shadow of the table's edge on the floor, the shadow of the bottles on the canvas, the shadow of Mr. Fenwick's hands as they move over the work. These shadows do not move when he does not move, and when he does move they move with the deliberate slowness of a man who has learned that the best tools respond best to unhurried hands. The table surface is covered with a sheet of oiled canvas that has been fitted to the table and held flat along the wall edge by a thin wooden batten. This canvas is Mr. Fenwick's working surface and has been for as long as the workshop has been his, and its appearance is the appearance of any surface that has been used daily for decades in a single trade, completely saturated with history. The stains on it are not random. To someone who understood them, they would constitute a kind of record. This circular mark where a jar was set down wet, this long diagonal run where a strained liquid caught the edge of the vessel at the wrong angle, this area of concentrated darkness near the lamp end of the table where the morning preparation work is always done, this lighter area toward the right where the bottles are filled and the canvas receives only the occasional drop. Mr. Fenwick knows all of this. He does not think about it as knowledge. It is simply the surface he works on, familiar in every detail the way a person's own home is familiar, without effort, without analysis. Tonight the surface holds what it always holds at this stage of the evening, the ingredients of the night's work, arranged in their proper order. To his left, a stoneware jar with a wide mouth and a fitted cloth cover, inside which sits the prepared oak gall extract. The galls arrived from his supplier in Bermondsey last Tuesday. A regular delivery, expected every 3 weeks, made by a boy of perhaps 14 who carries the small wrapped parcel with the indifference of someone performing a task of no particular interest and whose name Mr. Fenwick has never learned, though he has been receiving these deliveries from the same address for 11 years. The Galls were Aleppo oak galls, as they almost always are. Grown in the region around Aleppo in Syria and imported through the London trade routes, dried before shipping, their surface is the color of old wood with a slight greenish cast where the insect has bored its exit hole. They are dense and hard, and when broken they reveal an interior of pale woody material from which the tannic acid that is the essential active ingredient of iron gall ink, can be drawn with water and time. Mr. Fenwick broke these galls on Tuesday evening, on a piece of thick leather laid across the stone floor so the fragments did not scatter, using a wooden mallet whose handle has been worn to the shape of his grip by years of exactly this use. He broke them to pieces roughly the size of a thumbnail, then moved these pieces to his mortar, a heavy iron mortar, very old, brought from the Bermondsey workshop, and worked them with the pestle until the fragments were smaller, their surfaces more exposed, the pale interior material accessible to the water that would be added the following day. He spread the crushed material in the stoneware jar and covered it with water that had been allowed to stand overnight in a copper vessel. A practice he maintains from habit and from the instruction of his master, who believed that standing water had shed something of its sharpness by the time it was used, though what exactly it had shed Mr. Fenwick has never been able to determine. The galls soaked through Wednesday and into Thursday, the jar covered with doubled muslin and set on the shelf away from the lamp's heat. He stirred it each time he passed it, briefly, without ceremony, the way one adjusts a familiar thing without particular thought. By Thursday afternoon the water had taken on the color of very strong tea. Amber with a reddish undertone, clear but deeply colored, smelling of tannin in the particular way that tannin smells, which is to say like the interior of a very old piece of oak furniture combined with something faintly astringent, something that the back of the tongue recognizes before the conscious mind has formed a description for it. He strained it Friday morning through doubled muslin pressed into the mouth of a clean jar, working slowly, pressing the spent gall material gently with the back of a spoon until it was dry and the last of the tannin liquor had passed through. What remained in the jar, sealed now with its cloth cover and set on the table to the left of where he sits, is 4 days' worth of slow extraction, a clean, dark, slightly viscous liquid that is the first of the 4 things that make iron gall ink. The second sits to his right in a smaller jar of glazed earthenware, ferrous sulfate crystals dissolved in a small quantity of water. The crystals are called coppers in the trade, a name that comes from the old French coupe rose, from the copper-colored appearance of the mineral in some of its forms, though the crystals Mr. Fenwick uses are not copper-colored but a pale greenish-gray, fractionally luminous, the color of old sea glass. He dissolves them in water at a ratio he has not measured in many years but knows in his hands, the particular amount of coppers that, when added to the tannin extract, will produce an ink of the right darkness without excess acidity. The ferrous sulfate is what reacts with the tannic acid from the galls to produce the dark pigment of the ink, in a reaction that Mr. Fenwick has watched hundreds of times and that still retains, at the precise moment of chemical change, a quality that he would not quite call wonder but that is not entirely unlike wonder in its effect. Not surprise. He is not surprised. But there is something in watching a pale greenish liquid turn a deep, dark brownish-black within seconds of meeting the amber tannin that does not reduce entirely to the simply mechanical, that retains a quality of the unexpected even when the expectation is certain. The third material is gum arabic, kept in a dark earthenware pot with a tightly fitting lid. Gum arabic is the dried sap of the acacia tree, primarily from the Acacia senegal of sub-Saharan Africa. imported through the same commercial routes that bring galls and copras and the dozens of other materials that flow through London's trade to reach the workshops of the city's small manufacturers. In solution, dissolved in water over several days until the hard, yellowish lumps that arrive in the shipment have fully surrendered their structure and become a clear, slightly viscous liquid. Gum arabic acts as the binding agent of the ink, the substance that gives it body and flow, that allows it to sit on the surface of the paper long enough to sink into the fibers without spreading and bleeding into the surrounding area. Without gum arabic, iron gall ink will be too thin, too ready to run, too likely to spread beyond the line of the pen. With the right quantity, it flows from the nib with the even, controlled quality that stationers and clerks and solicitors' offices require from a writing ink. The fourth material is water, and it has already done its work in the soaking and the dissolving and the preparing, and is present now only as a constituent of everything else on the table, invisible in the mixture but present throughout it. Beside the 3 jars, along the right side of the table, lie 10 dark glass bottles on their narrow strip of wood. These bottles hold, when full, approximately 30 milliliters each, enough for a week of careful daily use in an office, enough for somewhat more in a domestic setting, enough to last a working clerk from Monday through Saturday with perhaps a small remainder. They are the size and shape of ink bottles have always been in this trade. Narrow-necked, wide-bodied, their glass a deep greenish-black that is not quite transparent but allows, when held to a strong light, a faint visibility through the walls of the bottle. This opacity is deliberate. Light degrades iron gall ink over time, promoting reactions that alter its color and its chemical stability, and so the bottles that hold it are made to be opaque in normal use, to keep their contents in the dark that best preserves them. Mr. Fenwick has always stored his finished stock on the lower shelf of the workshop cabinet, away from the lamp's reach, turned so that their cork necks face outward and their bodies sit in the building's shadow. Each of these 10 bottles was cleaned this morning. He washed them in water with a small amount of vinegar, both to clean the glass and to neutralize any alkalinity that might interfere with the ink's character, rinsed them thoroughly, and set them upside down on a folded cloth to drain until the interior was completely dry. He inspected each one by holding it to the lamp and turning it slowly, looking for any residue or cloudiness or crack or damage. 2 of the 10 are bottles that have been returned from a stationer's shop in Borough High Street and refilled before. They show, when inspected closely, a slight darkening of the glass near the bottom where previous batches of ink have left the faintest imaginable residue, and the others are new bottles, acquired in a dozen from the glass merchant on Union Street whose quality Mr. Fenwick has found reliable for 16 years. The corks, 10 of them, sit in a row beside the bottles. Each one cut from the same piece of Spanish cork bark, each slightly different in its exact resilience and diameter, as cork always is, because cork is a natural material and natural materials vary. He begins. He lifts the jar of gall extract from its position to his left and tips it slowly over the mixing bowl. A wide-mouthed ceramic bowl, glazed on the inside to a smooth, pale surface, its exterior plain earthenware of the kind made in large quantities in Staffordshire and sold throughout England for exactly this type of workshop use. The bowl sits in the center of the canvas, positioned with care so that it is at the precise distance from the lamp that experience has taught him is correct. Close enough to be well lit, far enough that the lamp's warmth does not accelerate the chemical process at an uneven rate. The tannin extract falls from the jar's lip in a slow, amber stream. Mr. Fenwick tips the jar at an angle that produces a controlled pour, not too fast, which would introduce air into the liquid, not too slow, which would cause it to dribble at the jar's lip and waste material. He has found the right angle for this particular jar, on this particular evening, through the first few seconds of the pour, and makes no conscious adjustment thereafter. His wrists know the angle. The stream is even, continuous, the color of the lamplight that falls through it from overhead. It makes, as it enters the bowl, a soft low sound that is almost a murmur. A sound like the quietest possible version of water falling from a height of a few inches onto a smooth surface, which is precisely what it is. He pours until the bowl holds what he estimates, without measuring, to be the correct quantity. The estimate is accurate. It has always been accurate. 34 years of practice at the same recipe with the same materials have calibrated his hands and his eyes to a precision that no measuring vessel would significantly improve. He sets the jar back on the canvas and rests. This pause is not fatigue. It is the pause that belongs between one action and the next when there is no reason to hurry, a pause that would not be visible to a watcher as a distinct event, because it is too small and too ordinary to mark. Mr. Fenwick simply sits for a moment with the jar set down and his hands folded in his lap, looking at the bowl. The tannin extract in the bowl has stilled now that the pour has ended. Its surface is flat and smooth, reflecting the lamp overhead in a small ellipse of amber light, a reflection of the flame, reduced and contained in the surface of the liquid, very still, very clear. He looks at this reflection without particular thought. It is simply what is there to look at, and looking at it requires nothing, and so he looks at it for a few seconds while the rest of his mind does whatever it does in the spaces between attentive work, which is very little. A low murmur of unformed content, the ordinary background of a quiet mind. Then he picks up the smaller jar. He tips the copper's solution into the bowl with more care than the first liquid, because the proportions here matter more precisely. He watches the pale greenish liquid leave the jar in a thin stream and enter the amber of the tannin extract, and as it does, the change begins. It begins at the immediate point of contact and spreads outward through the amber liquid in dark threads. Dark the way ink is dark, suddenly and completely, as though the color were waiting inside the tannin and the ferrous sulfate simply gave it permission to appear. The amber deepens rapidly through reddish-brown and dark mahogany to a deep, decided black, spreading from the site of contact outward in expanding irregular shapes until, by the time the last of the copper's solution has fallen into the bowl and the jar is set back on the canvas, the entire surface of the liquid in the bowl is black. Not brownish black, not very dark brown, black, the black of iron gall ink as it first appears, before oxidation deepens it further over the following hours. He picks up the glass stirring rod. This is a simple instrument, a length of glass tubing, sealed at both ends in a flame, perfectly smooth, perfectly clean. It is 20 centimeters long and as thick as the middle finger of a man's hand, and when it is drawn slowly through the liquid in the bowl it makes a sound that is barely audible, a sound that exists at the lowest edge of what hearing registers as distinct from silence. Something like the sound of a finger drawn slowly along the edge of a polished table. Something like the sound of silk settling. The rod moves in slow, even circles through the ink, bringing the outer liquid into the center and allowing the center to move outward, distributing the mixture throughout the bowl without agitation, without any movement quick enough to introduce air bubbles or to disturb the uniformity of the mixture. Mr. Fenwick stirs steadily and without varying his pace. There is a pace for this, and it is slow, and he keeps it without effort because the pace, like everything else in the evening's routine, is simply what is done. The rain outside shifts very slightly. Not in volume, the rain is no heavier and no lighter than it has been. but in the particular texture of the sound it makes, because the wind has turned by a few degrees and the drops now strike the window glass at a more oblique angle than before, making a sound that is marginally more percussive, more individual, each drop briefly distinct before the next arrives. The change lasts perhaps 2 minutes. Then the wind settles back and the rain resumes its original quality, which is to say the quality of a continuous sound, a texture without individual events, the quality of something that has been going on for a long while and intends to continue. Mr. Fenwick stirs for somewhat longer than strictly necessary. This is not because he is unaware that the mixing is complete, he is aware, and his hands know it. But because the stirring is not an unpleasant thing, and there is no reason to stop the moment it becomes technically sufficient. The feel of the glass rod moving through ink, the slight resistance of the liquid, the slow revolution of the hand at the wrist, is one of the physical textures of the evening's work, and textures that have been repeated several thousand times become, through that repetition, something close to comfort. He sets down the rod on the folded cloth that waits for it. He reaches for the gum arabic. The pot requires the right grip to remove its lid, a slight tilting pressure to break the seal that forms between the tight-fitting lid and the pot's rim, which always develops some adhesion from the dried residue of previous handlings. The lid comes free with a small sound, a soft pop, inaudible in most circumstances but clear enough in the quiet of the workshop. Inside, the solution is clear and faintly yellow, slightly more viscous than water, catching the lamplight at its surface with a very slight sheen. Mr. Fenwick uses a small pouring vessel specifically kept for this purpose, a narrow-necked ceramic bottle with a lip designed for precision, to transfer gum arabic from the pot into the mixing bowl. He pours slowly, letting the gum arabic enter the ink in a thin, controlled drizzle, moving the pouring vessel slightly from side to side so that the falling stream does not always strike the same point on the ink's surface. The gum arabic does not create the dramatic visible change of the copras. What it does is more subtle. A slight increase in the sheen of the ink's surface, a very small increase in the liquid's apparent weight, a change that is felt more than seen as he draws the stirring rod through the bowl again to incorporate it. The ink with gum arabic has a different quality on the rod than the ink without it, slightly more resistant, slightly more willing to cling to the glass, slightly more of a true liquid as opposed to a water-like one. These differences are small, and Mr. Fenwick does not consciously identify them each time he encounters them. He simply feels them, the way a person feels the difference between a familiar and an unfamiliar handshake without needing to analyze what the difference consists of. He stirs again, longer this time, incorporating the gum arabic fully. The bowl is ready. He sets down the rod and looks at what the bowl contains. The surface of the ink is smooth and still, very dark, reflecting the lamp overhead in the same small ellipse as before, the same flame, the same oval reflection, but in a liquid that is now more itself than it was a few minutes ago, more complete, more settled. The chemical processes that will continue inside each bottle for the next several hours have already begun, the oxidation proceeding at its own patient rate, the color deepening incrementally toward the final depth that iron gall ink reaches when fully developed. What is in the bowl is already ink. It will be somewhat better ink by midnight, and somewhat better still by tomorrow morning, and it will reach its full character within a day or two of the bottles being sealed. He takes the first bottle. He holds it briefly to the lamp before beginning to fill it, a brief inspection, confirming what he already confirmed this morning but confirms again as a matter of habit. The glass is clean. The interior is dry. The bottle is as it should be. He sets it down in front of the bowl and picks up the ladle. The ladle is copper, small, with a long handle and a pouring lip shaped to a gentle curve that allows a controlled stream. He dips it into the bowl carefully, keeping the ladle's bowl parallel to the ink's surface so that it fills smoothly without turbulence, then lifts it and holds it over the bottle's narrow neck and tilts it with the very slightest possible movement. The sound of ink entering a glass bottle is among the smallest sounds that exist in ordinary working life. It is a sound without much volume and with a great deal of character. The character of something falling from a very small height into a partially enclosed space, making a different sound as the bottle fills and the enclosed space diminishes, the acoustic quality of the interior changing as the liquid level rises. At the beginning, when the bottle is empty, there is a slight resonance to the sound, the drop of ink striking the bottle's interior amplified marginally by the air around it. As the filling continues and the air space decreases, the sound becomes closer, more intimate, more absorbed by the liquid itself. Mr. Fenwick listens to this sound. He does not listen with conscious attention. He is not trying to determine anything from it, but he is aware of it in the way he is aware of all the sounds of the evening, and the sound of filling is part of the texture of the work, part of the particular quality of this hour that distinguishes it from all other hours. He tips the ladle back precisely when the ink reaches the correct level. Not full to the neck, a few millimeters below, enough space for the cork to seat without displacing liquid over the rim. The ladle returns to the bowl. The first bottle stands ready. He picks up the first cork and seats it with firm, steady pressure from his thumb. The cork goes in smoothly. This is a good cork, correctly sized, well cut, and seats with a subtle compression, a slight final resistance that indicates it has found its fit. He sets the bottle aside and reaches for the second bottle, the third. The routine establishes itself in exactly the time it takes to understand it, which is to say it is already established before any thought about it is formed. The ladle dips and tilts and returns. The sound of filling sounds in its small, specific way. The cork settles. The bottle is set aside. Outside, the rain continues. It is not possible, from within the workshop, to hear individual sounds from the street beyond the general sound of the rain. The lane is too quiet at this hour for there to be anything to hear, and if there were it would be absorbed by the rain's continuity. Occasionally, from further away, a horse's hooves reach the ear from the direction of the broader road at the lane's south end, or a door somewhere closes with the particular dull resonance of a heavy Victorian door, and these sounds arrive and pass without demanding any response. The fourth bottle. The fifth. Mr. Fenwick's breathing is slow and regular. He is not thinking about breathing. He is not, in truth, thinking about very much at all in the deliberate sense. The work occupies the correct amount of attention, which is to say enough that the mind is engaged and not enough that it is pressed. In this space, somewhere between full attention and the inattention of a mind left entirely to its own devices, there is a particular quality of quietness. Not the quietness of an empty room, but the quietness of a mind that has found the pace of something it has done many times and has allowed the practice to carry it forward without effort. The shelf above the table holds the materials of the trade in their ordinary arrangement. Small cloth bags of dried galls, tied at the neck with kitchen string whose original white has yellowed. Earthenware pots of various sizes, each marked in Mr. Fenwick's own hand, the small, precise lettering of a person who has spent his life adjacent to the written word and who takes the making of marks seriously as a result. a wooden box with a fitted lid containing the copper's crystals in their cloth bag. Several lengths of very clean folded muslin. A glass jar, wide-mouthed, holding a loose collection of corks in various sizes, their rounded ends visible over the rim. At the shelf's far end, a row of larger dark bottles, the storage vessels for bulk ink, standing with their labels outward, their contents settled and dark, waiting for whatever next delivery will draw on them. None of this requires attention. It is simply there, in the way that familiar things are simply there, present and accounted for without needing to be noticed. The 6th bottle is filled and corked. The 7th. After the 7th bottle, Mr. Fenwick does something he does most evenings at roughly this point in the filling. He pauses, sets down the ladle, and looks at the window. The window shows him nothing. The curtains are drawn, and the faint amber rectangle of the street gaslight is too diffuse and too distant to carry any information. But looking at the window is a way of being briefly aware of what is beyond the room, of the lane and the city and the rain, of the fact that the workshop exists within a larger world that is proceeding with its own business in its own way, entirely indifferent to the 10 bottles on the canvas and the lamp overhead and the slow, rhythmic work of filling. This awareness does not trouble Mr. Fenwick. He has always found it a kind of comfort, the reminder that the work is small in scale and yet sufficient, that it requires no larger audience than the man performing it and the bottles receiving it, that the city outside can go about its concerns without reference to what is being done in this room, and that this is entirely as it should be. He has thought, in the quieter moments of many evenings, about what his work produces. Not in terms of commercial value or business necessity, but in terms of what the ink itself goes on to do. He knows his customers well enough to have some sense of it. There is the stationer on Borough High Street who stocks his ink in the small flat-bottomed bottles for domestic sale, for the households of clerks and shopkeepers and professional men who need an ink that will last and flow properly and not fade within the month. There is the solicitor's office in Tuley Street that takes a standing order of 12 bottles every month, which suggests that letters and contracts and documents of various kinds are being written there in ink that pass through this table, through this ladle, through these bottles, through the hands of a man in a workshop on Deadman's Lane who trimmed a wick on a rainy Tuesday morning and broke Galls on the same evening and brought the resulting liquid to this state for days later. There is the printer's agent in Blackfriars who sometimes places large orders for bulk ink for use in hand presses, smaller print runs than the great cylinder machines require, the kind of printing that a small workshop does when it is printing pamphlets or job cards or the labels that go on bottles of various kinds. And there is, every few months, a letter from a correspondent in Oxford who purchases the ink directly, in quantity, for reasons that have never been fully explained in correspondence and that Mr. Fenwick has never thought to ask about, though he imagines, without particular evidence, that it is for some kind of scholarly writing, that somewhere in Oxford, on paper that the correspondent considers worth writing on, his ink is making words that will remain. These thoughts are not grand. They do not carry with them any sense of significance or any desire for recognition. They are simply the ordinary reflections of a man who makes a thing that is used to make other things, and who has spent enough years at the making to have some sense of where the made thing goes and what becomes of it. There is a satisfaction in this that is not pride and not sentiment but something quieter. Something like the satisfaction of a task that is connected, however distantly and indirectly, to a purpose larger than itself. He picks up the ladle and fills the 8th bottle. The bowl is becoming less full now, and the work of filling requires more attention than it did for the earlier bottles. As the liquid level in the bowl drops, a very fine sediment becomes visible at the bowl's base. the thinnest possible remnant of gall material that passed through the doubled muslin despite his care in straining, particles so small they were invisible in the liquid when it was first strained but have been settling by degrees throughout the evening, sinking imperceptibly toward the bottom of the bowl while the filling work proceeded above them. These particles must not enter the bottles. A well-made iron gall ink should be clear, or nearly so. Not perfectly transparent, since the iron and tannin compounds give it its characteristic slight opacity, but clear of visible sediment, clear of the particles that would settle at the bottom of a buyer's inkwell and clog the nib of a pen or simply look like the ink was carelessly made. Mr. Fenwick angles the ladle with special care for the 8th bottle. He keeps the ladle's bowl away from the bowl's base, drawing the ink from the middle of the depth rather than from the very bottom, tilting with great precision and watching the stream that falls from the ladle's lip to ensure it runs clean. It does. The 8th bottle fills with ink that is, to his practiced eye, free of sediment. He sets it aside and corks it and pauses again before reaching for the 9th. The 9th will be the last full bottle. The 10th will be partial. There is always a small remainder at the bottom of the bowl, always this slight quantity of ink that contains too much sediment to use but too little to simply pour out without the sense that something is being wasted. He will cover the bowl tonight and pour the remainder into a separate vessel tomorrow, allowing it to stand so the sediment settles further and can be drawn off at the top as clean ink for mixing into a new batch. This is how the work is conducted. Without waste, without hurry, with the accumulated attention of long practice, each session's remainder becoming part of the next session's beginning. He fills the 9th bottle. The sound of the filling is very slight. The ladle holds only a small amount of ink, the bowl is nearly empty now, the liquid sitting shallow. And the stream that falls from the ladle into the bottle is thinner than it was for any of the earlier bottles, a narrow line of dark liquid, catching the lamp's light as it falls, turning momentarily to a fine dark gleam. Mr. Fenwick watches this with the same quiet attention with which he has watched everything else in the evening, not intensely, not analytically, but with the steady awareness of someone engaged in a task they know well and wish to do well. The 9th cork seats itself with its small, definitive compression. He looks at what the bowl now holds, a thin layer of ink above settled sediment, perhaps a teaspoon's worth of clean liquid remaining above the darker deposit. He does not attempt to draw this into the ladle. Instead he reaches for the oiled cloth cover and presses it down over the bowl's rim, sealing it loosely. The bowl and its remnant will wait on the table until morning. The 10th bottle will be filled to approximately 2/3. This is a bottle he intends for his own use, kept here in the workshop in the small inkstand on the high desk near the door where he sometimes sits to write letters or mark invoices. 2/3 full is more than enough for several weeks of that kind of occasional use, and a bottle that is somewhat less than full is not a defect but simply a reflection of the batch quantity, which is what it is. He fills the 10th bottle. He corks it. He sets it in its place at the end of the row. 10 dark glass bottles stand on the canvas surface, corked, waiting for their wax seals. They are very still and very quiet in the lamplight, their identical shapes and colors making them look, in the amber light, like a small company of very simple objects that have found each other's company sufficient. He picks up the taper. To light it, he stands slightly from his stool and extends his arm toward the lamp overhead, holding the taper's end near the flame but not quite touching. The taper catches in a moment, a small clear flame appears at its end, very bright in the dimness, the kind of brightness that is disproportionate to its size in the way that all small fires seem disproportionately alive. He brings it back down to the table and holds it near the corner of the dark wax block, angling the taper so the flame warms the corner of the wax without touching it directly. The wax begins to soften. A small bead of molten wax forms at the corner and grows, slow and bright, until it is large enough to be useful. He tips this bead over the cork of the first bottle. The molten wax falls in a single drop and spreads as it strikes, flowing outward from the point of impact in a slow, viscous circle that fills the gap between cork and bottle rim and settles into the slight irregularities of the cork's surface. The drop cools quickly at its edges, the surface turning from bright liquid to dull solidity in the few seconds it takes to move the taper back to the wax block and warm another bead. He leaves the first bottle to finish cooling and turns to the second. The wax work is the final stage of the evening's making, and it is the stage that requires the least precision and permits the most even pace. Each bottle receives its small crown of dark red wax in exactly the same way, the heated bead formed, the bead applied, the wax spreading and cooling while the next bottle is prepared. The taper is a simple instrument, consumed as it is used, its length diminishing by a centimeter or so for each pair of bottles, and it must be refreshed at the lamp flame twice during the sealing of 10 bottles, each refreshment a brief interruption, the extension of the arm, the moment of contact with the lamp, the small bright addition of flame to the taper's burning end, the return to the table. Third bottle. Fourth. The wax falls from the taper in its controlled drops. Each one cools and dulls. Each bottle becomes, as the wax hardens, sealed against the air in a way that the cork alone cannot quite achieve. The cork creates a physical barrier, but the wax creates a chemical one, filling every small gap through which air might slowly find its way over weeks of storage. Fifth. Sixth. The rain outside is, if anything, slightly heavier than it was earlier in the evening, or perhaps the wind has shifted again and the drops are striking the window glass more directly. The sound is marginally fuller, marginally more present, though still entirely in the register of background rather than foreground, still entirely the sound of an evening's weather continuing its ordinary course without any relationship to the 10 bottles on the table or the man sealing them. Seventh. Eighth. The taper requires its second refreshment after the 8th bottle, and Mr. Fenwick extends his arm to the lamp flame for the last time this evening, then brings the flame back to the wax block, then to the 9th bottle's cork. 9th. 10th. He pinches out the taper with his fingertips, the gesture of a man who has snuffed tapers this way so many times that the slight heat of the pinch is completely unremarkable, does not register as anything other than a familiar sensation of minor warmth. And sets the taper stub on the small dish kept for exactly this purpose. He sits back on the stool and looks at the row of completed bottles. They stand as they have stood since the last one was corked, 10 small dark objects in a row on the stained canvas, each with its rounded cap of dark red wax now fully hardened, each containing the same substance in the same quantity and the same state of development. They are, in the precise sense of the word, done. The evening's work has produced exactly what it was supposed to produce, in exactly the quantity that was intended, with exactly the quality that his long practice ensures. There is nothing remarkable about this. It happens every time he makes a batch, and this is perhaps the 100th batch made in this workshop, or the 150th, he has not counted them, any more than he counts his own heartbeats. And yet the fact of completion, the fact of 10 bottles standing where this morning there were none, this has a quality to it that Mr. Fenwick would not call satisfaction in any emphatic sense, but that is, in a quieter way, something like it. The recognition that the work is concluded and was conducted as it should have been. That the materials were properly prepared and properly combined and the product is properly made. That tomorrow he will write labels in his small, exact hand, apply them to the bottles, record the batch in his ledger, and send word to the stationer and the solicitor's office and the printer's agent that new stock is ready for collection. That is tomorrow's business, and it requires nothing of this evening except that the bottles are ready, which they are. He stands. The movement from sitting to standing, after an evening of careful, stationary work, has the quality of a slow extension. Limbs remembering that they are limbs, the spine straightening to its full length, the body resuming its full upright form after several hours of the slight forward lean that close work always requires. He does not stretch in any deliberate way. He simply stands, and the standing is itself a kind of release. He removes his apron, untying the tape at the back with the same automatic efficiency with which he tied it several hours earlier, and hangs it on the wooden peg beside the door. He rolls down his sleeves, his fingers finding the fold of the cloth without looking, smoothing the flannel back to its full length and doing the single button at each cuff. He picks up the folded cloth that held the stirring rod and the cloth he used to wipe the table and carries them to the small wooden pail near the door, where they will sit until morning when they can be rinsed in the water that comes from the tap at the back of the yard. He goes to the shelf and checks, briefly, the condition of the materials stored there. The remaining galls in their cloth bag are sufficient for one more batch, perhaps slightly less. He will need to write to the Bermondsey supplier by the end of the week. The copras is well stocked. He received a new quantity last month and has used perhaps a quarter of it. The gum arabic is low enough that the pot needs checking. He opens it, holds it to the lamp, enough for one more batch, no more. He will add it to the letter for the supplier. These are tomorrow's considerations. He closes the pot, returns it to the shelf, and turns back to the room. The table is clean. The bowl is covered. The 10 bottles stand in their row. The stirring rod is on its cloth. The ladle is beside the bowl. The taper stub is on its dish. Everything is where it belongs at the end of the evening's work, in the positions it has been left in at the end of every evening's work for 27 years. He turns the oil lamp's wheel down by 3/4. The light diminishes, the circle of warmth it casts contracting, the shadows at the room's edges deepening to a near darkness in which the shapes of the furniture and the shelf and the row of bottles are still visible but softened, turn to suggestion. The lamp will burn at this low setting through the night, consuming only a small quantity of oil, providing the faint visible warmth that Mr. Fenwick prefers to leave as a presence in the workshop during the hours when he is upstairs. He does not extinguish it entirely. He has never extinguished it entirely. It is not superstition. He does not believe that a low lamp keeps anything away or attracts anything toward it. It is simply a preference, the preference for a workshop that is not entirely dark, that maintains its faint suggestion of occupancy through the night, that shows, through the gap in the curtain, the slightest amber intimation to the wet lane outside that the room behind the curtain is not empty, is not abandoned, belongs to someone who will return to it in the morning. He picks up his coat from the second peg. Heavy dark wool, the coat of a working man who is outdoors only when he must be and who wants, on those occasions, to be adequately warm. He buttons it from the bottom upward in the order that is simply the order, first, second, third, fourth, collar last. He picks up his key from the hook beside the door. He takes one last look at the table, which tells him what it always tells him at this point in the evening, that everything is as it ought to be. That the work is complete. That the 10 bottles are there, and sealed, and ready. He opens the door quietly and goes upstairs. The workshop is empty now, though empty is not quite the right word for a room that contains 10 sealed bottles and a covered bowl and a lamp burning very low and 27 years of accumulated practice pressed into every surface. It is simply a room without a person in it, which is a different kind of quiet from the quiet of a room being worked in. Less present, more settled, the sounds that remain being only the rain against the window and the faint sound of the lamp's flame, which is a sound so small it exists at the threshold of audibility, barely there, barely a sound at all, more the memory of a sound than the sound itself. The 10 bottles stand in their row on the canvas. Their wax seals have been fully hardened for an hour now, and they will not be disturbed until the morning. Inside each one, the iron gall ink continues the slow chemical work of being what it is. The oxidation that has been proceeding since the coppers entered the tannin extract some hours ago continues at its unhurried rate, the color deepening by increments that are invisible to the eye but real in their cumulative effect. By morning, the ink in these bottles will be fractionally darker than it was when the corks went in. By the end of the week, it will have reached the depth of color that iron gall ink reaches at its best, a true black that is not the flat black of carbon ink but the deep, slightly warm black of iron and tannin, a black that carries within it the complex chemistry of oak galls and the particular geography of the places where oak gall wasps make their small, efficient homes. This ink, when it reaches the stationers and the offices and the households and wherever else it eventually goes, will be used to write things. Letters, most likely. The letters of ordinary life, the kind written on a Tuesday evening by a clerk to a distant cousin, or by a tradesman to a supplier, or by a wife to a friend in another city, or by a solicitor's assistant drawing up the terms of some small transaction. Perhaps also, sometimes, something more consequential. A contract, a declaration, a document that will matter to the people who sign it in ways that matter very much. The ink does not distinguish between these uses. It flows from whatever nib it enters with the same even character regardless of what is being written, carrying the words where the hand directs them, drying to its characteristic dark permanence, remaining on the page through seasons and years in the way that iron gall ink has always remained, even as the paper beneath it ages and yellows. The lamp burns very low, its circle of warmth diminished to a small suggestion. The rain continues against the window glass, steady, patient, indifferent to the hour and to the contents of the room and to the 10 bottles sitting in their row on the dark canvas surface, each one sealed and quiet, each one containing exactly what was intended. Upstairs, Mr. Fenwick has moved through the small routine of his evening rooms. The coat hung, the kettle put to heat on the small grate, the armchair by the fireplace inhabited for the first time since morning, the plain mahogany clock on the mantelpiece noted without particular attention. The fire in the grate was laid ready this morning and needs only the application of a taper from the mantelpiece to bring it to life. He lights it, and the coals catch in their own time. First the paper beneath them, then the wood kindling set between the bottom coals, then the coals themselves, one by one taking the heat and beginning to glow at their edges before the glow spreads inward and the whole small fire comes properly into being. This takes several minutes. He sits in the armchair and watches it happen without hurry. The rooms above the workshop are not elaborate. A sitting room, a bedroom, a small area at the back where a water pipe serves the stone sink. The furnishings are older, most of them, than the workshop itself, pieces that came to him from his father's household when his father died and that have outlasted the father by 23 years now, with no indication of ending their service any time soon. The armchair is very comfortable in the way that armchairs become comfortable after decades of being sat in by the same person. The kettle on the grate begins to murmur before it boils, a sound somewhere between the silence of cold water and the full sound of steam, the preliminary of a boil, the sound of water becoming aware that it is heating. Mr. Fenwick recognizes this sound from having heard it several thousand times and reaches for the teapot on the mantelpiece without looking, and sets it on the hearth near the fire to warm. The fire is fully established now, the coals glowing orange in the dimness of the room, their light shifting slightly as the combustion processes within them shift and adjust. The fire in a small Victorian grate is not a large fire. The grate is designed to contain a modest quantity of coal and to direct its heat outward rather than upward, and what it produces is warmth for a small room rather than warmth for any ambition beyond that. But a small room is what this is, and the warmth is sufficient, and the light that the fire adds to the room has a quality that the oil lamp downstairs does not have and that the gas lighting in broader streets does not have, the quality of variability, of movement, of a light that is not fixed but shifts and breathes and makes the familiar shadows of the room shift and breathe along with it. Mr. Fenwick sits in the armchair by the fire and makes his tea when the kettle fully boils, and sits with the cup warming his hands and the fire warming his face, and the sound of the rain on the window above him is the same sound that has been in his hearing all evening, the same patient continuity, unchanged by his move from the workshop below to the sitting room above. He will sit here for perhaps an hour. Then he will go to bed. Tomorrow the labels need writing. The stationer needs to be notified. The supplier in Bermondsey needs a letter about galls and gum arabic. The ledger needs updating with tonight's batch. There are several things to do, and they will be done, in the order they need to be done, with the same attention and the same unhurried pace that has characterized the work for 27 years. But that is tomorrow. Tonight is this armchair and this fire and this cup of tea and the rain on the glass, and the 10 sealed bottles standing on the canvas below, and the low lamp keeping its small faith in the empty workshop, and the sound of the city going on in its own patient way beyond the window, as it always has and will continue to do long after any particular evening's work has been completed and set aside. The fire settles. The tea cools slightly in the cup. The rain continues. The clock on the mantelpiece ticks with the small, even sound of a clock that has been ticking in the same room for 23 years and intends to continue, measuring time not because time needs measuring but because measuring it is simply what it does, and doing what one does is itself a kind of contentment. Mr. Fenwick closes his eyes. Not yet to sleep. He will finish his tea first, and perhaps sit a little longer, and read a few pages if he feels like it, and only then go to the bedroom where the bed has been made since morning, the sheets folded back at the right angle, the pillow at the right height. But his eyes are closed now, and the fire warms his face, and the sound of the rain is the same sound it has been all evening, patient and continuous and entirely without urgency, and the chair is comfortable in the way of long acquaintance, and the tea is warm in the cup, and the evening is very quiet in the way that evenings become quiet when the work is done and the room is warm and there is nothing remaining that needs attending to. Everything is as it ought to be. Everything is as it has been, and as it will be. The 10 bottles downstairs are sealed. The lamp below burns low. The rain falls on Deadman's Lane and on all the lanes of Southwark and on the dark water of the Thames and on the cobblestones of the whole city and on the rooftops and the chimney pots and the old brickwork of buildings that have been standing longer than anyone now living can remember. The city goes on. The rain goes on. The gas lamps at their intervals along the broader streets burn with their amber warmth, visible through the falling rain as soft, diffuse illuminations, keeping company with no one in particular, simply being there, as lamps are there, present, steady, requiring nothing. And here, in a room 3 stories above a small workshop on a lane whose name is older than the building it leads to, a man who makes ink sits with his eyes closed by a small fire, his teacup cooling in his hands, and the sound of the rain on the glass is the last thing he hears before his breathing slows to the rate of sleep, and the evening closes over him as gently as a curtain drawn across a window, and all the small sounds of the night continue outside the border of his awareness. Faithful and unhurried, needing nothing from him, content to be what they are. Thank you for spending this evening at Mr. Fenwick's workshop and the quiet rooms above. If this hour brought you some peace, it will always be here when you wish to return. We would appreciate it if you subscribed to our channel and left a quiet comment below, even just a single word, and if you want more of these evenings, this channel would be happy to have you. Wherever you are tonight, sleep well.